Our topic tonight is Tyre in the Bible. We're going to consider the history and meaning of Tyre, the city of Tyre, the city-state of Tyre in the Bible, particularly in the prophecies of Ezekiel, where we find a rather well-known, perhaps I should say notorious prophecy about the king of Tyre in the Garden of Eden, which has a variety of mooted interpretations. And that's where we're going to be going. To begin with, and in order to set the stage for even interpreting that prophecy, we have to see what the Bible says about Tyre in general. Your notes have Roman numeral number 1, location of Tyre, Joshua 19:29, and a whole lot of space there where I had intended to draw a map and forgot about it. I'm approaching that eldership age. I only have another decade or so to go, and I'm starting to lose it already, so I forgot to give you the map. But if you were to imagine a map of Israel, it's just on the north side on the coast, and actually was assigned originally as part of Israel. Joshua 19:29, talking about the tribe of Asher, says, the border turned to Ramah and to the fortified city of Tyre, and then the border turned to Hosah, and it ended at the sea by the region of Akzib. And previous to that, verse 28 says that Asher went from Ebron and Rehob and Haman and Cana as far as Great Sidon. So Tyre and Sidon were both Canaanite cities included within the tribe of Asher, but they were never taken by Asher and eventually wound up being separate city-states and apparently never actually came in any physical, geographical sense into the nation of Israel. Now, who were the Tyrians? What race were they? You may know Genesis chapter 10 tells us who the descendants of Noah were from their 3 families and who their grandsons were, and more or less maps out everybody in the Bible for us. For instance, when we read about the Philistines in the Bible, you need always to remember that the Philistines are Egyptians. Genesis 10 tells us that. And so when you read about the Philistines and what they do, you have to connect it up with the Egyptians and what they've done. And the whole story of Saul and David and the capture of the ark and David dealing with the Philistines and the like is a recapitulation of Moses' experience with the Egyptians. And the reason for that is that the Philistines are Egyptians. Similarly, in the story of Abraham, when Abraham goes to Egypt and Pharaoh takes Sarah into his harem, or Sarai at that time was her name. Later on he goes to Philistia, and Abimelech does the same thing. Well, these are basically the same. They're cousins. And Genesis 10 tells us that. Now we look at Genesis 10, it doesn't tell us anything about Tyre. And considering how much Tyre figures later on in the Bible, that is curious. We are, however, told in Genesis 10:15 that Sidon and the Sidonians were Canaanites. Genesis 10, verse 15, we're looking at the sons of Ham. And Ham's youngest son was Canaan. And Canaan became the father of Sidon, his firstborn, and of Heth, that is the Hittites, Jebusites, Amorites, Girgashites, Hivites, Arkites, Sinites, Arvadites, Zemarites, and Hamathites. So those are all the Canaanites. And the Sidonians are Canaanites, and because of their close connection with the Tyrians, we assume that they were probably of a Canaanite race originally too. Now, because they were Phoenicians and were sea traders, they may well have tremendously intermarried with other groups. And so racially, the Bible does not fill in later on who they were. We just have to go with the fact that it was a city-state on the north Mediterranean coast of Israel and north of Mount Carmel. When Tyre really shows up in the Bible the first time after Joshua 19, it's to make a covenant with Israel. And this is where it becomes very important for us to understand Tyre's relationship to Israel and why Tyre shows up in prophecy later on. The covenant with Israel is laid out, first of all, in 2 Samuel 5:10-12, where we read that Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees and carpenters and stonemasons, and they built a house for David. And David realized that Yahweh had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. Now, I should have started in verse 10. David became greater and greater, for Yahweh, God of hosts, was with him, Then Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers with all this stuff to build a house. And David realized that Yahweh had established him and exalted his kingdom. Now there is a connection, you see, quite obviously, between God being with David and Hiram sending stuff to David and David realizing that God was with him. These things are put together here. Now, why is that? The reason is that after the Noachic covenant, all the other covenants in the Old Testament are specifications of the Noachic covenant. God came to Noah and he said, I'm going to reposition the world in union with you, and this rainbow in the sky will be a sign to me. God says, I will see the rainbow every time there's a cloud, and whenever God shows up, there's a cloud around him, so he's always seeing the rainbow. Sometimes we see it, but what's important is that God see it. And I will remember my peace with you, Noah, the church, and through you, all creation. Now that is the formation of the Gentile church. Now, at the Tower of Babel, that covenant falls. Every time God makes a covenant, it goes along for a while, and then people sin, and we have to have a new covenant. And the covenant with Noah proceeds into the 70 nations of the world in Genesis 10, the descendants of Noah. And at the Tower of Babel, the 70 nations of the world fall into sin, and so God has to start a new covenant. And what he does is he selects one nation out of the 70 and makes them to be priests to all the rest. Now that's a specification of the Noachic covenant. One nation will be priests to all the rest, and that's Abraham. Abraham, the Hebrew. Eber. Now if we read the genealogies in Genesis 11, Eber has two sons, Peleg and Joktan. Peleg is the ancestor of Abraham. Joktan has 13 sons, and it says the Joktanites moved to the east. And then just a few verses later in Genesis 11, it says, as they journeyed east, they came to a plain and built the Tower of Babel. So the leaders in the Tower of Babel enterprise were Nimrod the Hamite and Joktan the Hebrew. And the apostate Hebrews, sons of Shem, joined with the Canaanites, the Hamites, to build the Tower of Babel, and then God judged it. And God sets up the Abrahamic covenant, the patriarchal covenant. What we see from then on, however, is that every time God sets up a new covenant within this priestly nation, there's always a Gentile sponsor. Because the essence of the Abrahamic covenant is, those who bless you, I will bless. Those who curse you, I will curse. And you will be a father of many nations, and through you all the nations will be blessed. And so all the other 69 nations are supposed to have a great interest in the Jews, in the Hebrews, Israelites, Jews. Their name changes with each covenant. In this first covenant, they're called Hebrews. Eberites, descendants of Eber. God's covenant with the Hebrews is done in the midst of the nations, and all the nations are supposed to have an interest in it. So the faithful Gentiles want to sponsor the Hebrews. They want to set them up and say, yes, you be priests for us. You mediate between God and us, because we've seen that God gets angry when we do things like the Tower of Babel. Man is very bad, and God is very mad, right? And so we want some mediators between us and God, and we're real happy, Abraham, that you're going to be the mediator, and so we want to sponsor you. Who is the sponsor of the patriarchal covenant? Melchizedek. Melchizedek is the Gentile sponsor of the patriarchal covenant. He comes out and he gives bread and wine to Abram. Melchizedek was not circumcised. He was a Noachic God-fearer. And throughout the Old Testament, we have many, many references to Gentile God-fearers. Numbers chapter 15 talks about uncircumcised, God-fearing Gentiles who want to offer sacrifices and how they can come. The Psalms talk about uncircumcised, God-fearing Gentiles worshiping God. It says, O house of Aaron, praise the Lord. O you Levites, praise the Lord. O you people of Israel, praise the Lord. O you God-fearers, praise the Lord. The whole city of Nineveh was converted by Jonah and became uncircumcised, God-fearing Gentiles. They weren't members of the priestly nation, but they were interested in the priestly nation. I think it's likely that early Zoroastrianism was a form of Gentile God-fearing belief, from what you can tell from what little we have from that time and the way they interact with the other cultures in the Bible itself. When we come down to the New Testament, we find uncircumcised Gentile God-fearers around the church, but they weren't new, see. They'd been there all along. So we have the Noachic nations, the 69 nations are supposed to sponsor the Jews, to be their priests, and to assist them and help them. And Melchizedek comes to Abraham and sponsors him, and Pharaoh sponsors Joseph. Now, the initial fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant comes with Joseph. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. Joseph goes down to Egypt, and Joseph says in Genesis 45, God has made me a father to Pharaoh. Abraham will be a father of many nations. At this point, Abraham, Joseph, is a father to the whole Egyptian nation. In Genesis 47, we find Pharaoh getting down on his knees in front of Jacob and asking for the blessing of Yahweh. Now, that is an indication that he recognizes the priestly character of the Israelite nations. And he gives them the best of the land of Goshen, which is like the garden of God. And all the Egyptian servants are seen rejoicing. It says Joseph's brothers came down to Egypt, and all the Egyptians in Pharaoh's household rejoiced. And when Jacob dies, Pharaoh and his household and the Egyptians go up and they mourn. You see, nothing could be clearer than that this is a picture of a converted Gentile nation that is benefiting from the priestly work of Israel. So they become, at this stage in history, Gentile sponsors of the patriarchal covenant. The next covenant that comes is the Sinaitic covenant. And who's the Gentile sponsor there? Right off the bat, it's Jethro. Not only does Jethro sponsor Moses for 40 years, and Moses marries Jethro's daughter. Jethro is a descendant of Abraham, but he is an uncircumcised descendant. He is a descendant of Abraham's wife Keturah, not in the priestly line. And so while Moses is living with them, he doesn't circumcise his children. He figures that, he's out of the priestly line too, and he'll never be going back to Israel. And when God tells him, nope, I'm going to send you back, then he has to circumcise his sons to get back into Israel. And when he doesn't do it, God meets him on the way and threatens him until he does. But Jethro is your God-fearing Noachic priest who sponsors Moses, and then when Israel comes out of Egypt, he sponsors them. He welcomes them. Umberto Cassuto, in his commentary on Exodus, has as his title of this section, Israel is welcomed by the nations of the world, when Jethro comes out to meet them. And Jethro actually helps set up the covenant. Notice Melchizedek gives bread and wine to help set up the Abrahamic covenant. Jethro comes and teaches Moses how to organize the kingdom to help set up the Sinaitic covenant. Well, now we come down to the kingdom covenant. And who are the sponsors here? Well, the primary sponsor is Hiram I of Tyre. And Hiram is going to send all kinds of cedar wood and stones and masons and experts to help David build a palace and then help Solomon build the temple to Yahweh. He sponsors it. And we also find that the Pharaoh of Egypt sends his daughter to marry Solomon. And we'll glance at that a little bit as we go, but we find a Gentile sponsor in the north and a Gentile sponsor in the south. We're not told a whole lot about Pharaoh, except that his daughter marries Solomon, and then, of course, the whole Song of Solomon, I think, is about that. I don't know who else this girl is, if she's not Solomon's youthful bride before he started collecting wives, like kids collect pogs, or like I collect comic books. The Song of Solomon deals with Solomon and Mrs. Solomon, which is what Shulamith means. It's just feminine of Solomon. We're not told her name. Well, at any rate, we'll come back to this. Hiram is the sponsor, and he, just as Jethro helps organizes the people temple, and Melchizedek gives bread and wine, which are temple sacraments, Hiram builds the temple. And now in the Restoration Covenant, we have Gentile sponsors, and we have a set of 4 Gentile sponsors, and they're set out in Daniel, and we looked at that last year for those of you that are here. We have the Babylonian sponsor, the Persian sponsor, the Greek sponsor, and the Roman sponsor. The primary one is the Persian sponsor. Cyrus sends the people back and says, get back there and worship Yahweh for me, because I know that He is the real God, the true God. Now, Cyrus was trained by Zoroaster. Zoroaster was his tutor. And apparently, Zoroastrians at that stage regarded Yahweh of Israel as the same God they were talking about. And so Cyrus says, get that temple built because this is the real God. And they were hostile to the other gods of the nations. They tolerated them, but they sponsored the God of Israel. Darius, even more so. Darius builds the temple and makes sure that it's built. So he's a lot like Hiram. Before that time, Nebuchadnezzar had been the sponsor of Daniel. Nabonidus, who succeeded Nebuchadnezzar, elevated King Jehoiachin back to position in the captivity. After the Persians, Alexander came. Remember, we studied this last year. Alexander does not sack Jerusalem. He destroys Tyre, but he leaves Jerusalem alone, and the Greeks sponsor Israel for a while until they turn bad, and then the Romans come, and the Romans sponsor God's people. And all you have to do is read the book of Acts. Every time the Jews try to attack the church, the Romans defend it. And the book of Revelation talks about this when it talks about the Roman Empire going apostate and becoming a beast. And that happens with Nero, and it happens, right there at the end. But until that time, the Romans, they had a hard time dealing with the Jews, but they were basically trying to, in God's providence, they were the Gentile sponsors. The main thing to notice is Melchizedek, Jethro, Hiram, and Cyrus and Darius. That at every point when the covenant is set up, they're Gentile sponsors because the Gentiles want the Israelites to be the priests to the nations. Now, Hiram is not just some fortuitous Gentile sponsor. Hiram is actually a convert to the worship of Yahweh as the only true God. There may be other powers in the universe. Remember that in the Old Covenant, angels ruled the world, and people knew that angels ruled the world, and I think that when we look at archaic religions and religions of the old world, we have to understand, and this is not a popular 20th century idea, that there really were spiritual beings that occasionally people came in contact with. And that doesn't happen now. And I don't know quite what to make out of that, except that the book of Daniel talks about it a little bit, and so does other evidence. But whatever the case may have been, Hiram is presented in the Bible as somebody who knows the true God. 2 Chronicles chapter 1, verses 1 to 16 lays a lot of this out, and I'll just read the whole thing to you. Just listen unless you want to follow along. Solomon decided to build a house for the name of Yahweh and a house for his own royalty. We call them temple and palace, but in Hebrew it's the same word. So Solomon assigned 70,000 men to carry loads and 80,000 men to quarry in the mountains and 3,600 to supervise them. Then Solomon sent word to Hiram, king of Tyre, saying, "As you dealt with David my father and sent him cedars to build him a house to dwell in, so do for me. Behold, I am about to build a house for the name of Yahweh my God, dedicating it to him, to burn fragrant incense before him, to set the face bread continually out, and to offer ascension offerings morning and evening, on Sabbaths and on new moons and on the appointed feasts of Yahweh our God, this being required forever in Israel." Notice what he says. He says to Hiram, we're going to set this temple up so we can do all this sacrificial worship because that's what Israel is appointed to do. In other words, he reminds him of the fact that Israel is a priest to the other nations. Verse 5, "The house that I am about to build will be great, for greater is our God than all the gods. But who is able to build a house for him? For heavens and highest heavens can't contain him. So who am I that I should build a house for him except to burn incense before him?" In other words, the house isn't built for God, it's built for his name. I'm going to build a house for the name of Yahweh, but a house can't be built for him in himself. Verse 7, "And now send me a skilled man to work in gold, silver, bronze, and iron, and in purple, red, and violet, wool." Wool is what's dyed. "And one who knows how to make engravings, to work with skilled men whom I have in Judah and Jerusalem, whom David my father provided. Send me also cedar, cypress, and algum timber from Lebanon, for I know that your servants know how to cut timber of Lebanon. And indeed my servants will work with your servants to prepare timber in abundance for me, for the house that I am about to build will be great and wonderful. And now behold, I will give to your servants, the woodsmen who cut the timber, 20,000 cores of crushed wheat, 20,000 cores of barley, 20,000 baths of wine, and 20,000 baths of oil." Now notice the exchange here. Israel is food land. They provide food. And the other nation provides other stuff. Timber, stone, raw materials. And you have this picture of Israel as Eden, as food land, as providing food for the world. Analogous to Joseph providing food. Analogous to sacraments. And the other nations in exchange provide all the other stuff. And that relationship is important here. Verse 11, "Then Hiram first, king of Tyre, answered in a letter sent to Solomon, Because Yahweh loves his people, he has made you king over them." Well, that's a very nice statement. Because Yahweh loves his people, he has made you king over them. He's given them a good king. Then Hiram continued, "Blessed be Yahweh, God of Israel, who made heaven and earth, who has given King David a wise son, endowed with discretion and understanding, who will build a house for Yahweh and a royal palace for himself. Now I'm sending a skilled man endowed with understanding, Hiram Abi, son of a Danite woman and a Tyrian father, who knows how to work in gold, silver, bronze, iron, stone, wood, purple, violet, linen, crimson, who knows how to make all kinds of engravings, etc." So this is worked out. But notice that Hiram says God is the true God who made heaven and earth. And it's important to see that the Tyrians enter into covenant with Israel and build the temple. Hiram is converted. Now, he's not the only Gentile converted at this time in history. Psalm 87 refers to others converted at this stage in history during the evangelistic glories of David and Solomon's reign. Psalm 87, I'm sure you're familiar with this psalm, or most of you are. It says, "His foundation is the holy mountains. Yahweh loves the gates of Zion more than all the other dwelling places of Jacob. Glorious things of thee are spoken, Zion, city of our God. I will mention Egypt and Babylon among those who know me. Behold, Philistia and Tyre with Ethiopia. This one was born there. And of Zion it shall be said, this one and that one were born in her. And the Most High himself will establish her. Yahweh shall count when he registers the peoples. This one was born there." Let me ask you something. Where were you born? You were born in Jerusalem, all of you. That's what this is saying. Doesn't matter where you were born physically. If you are engrafted into the kingdom, you're born in Jerusalem. And that's what he's saying. People in Rahab, that's Egypt, Babylon, Philistia, Tyre, and Ethiopia were actually born in Zion. Okay, who were some Egyptians who were born in Zion? Well, Pharaoh's daughter, and probably some other Egyptians. If Pharaoh is marrying with Solomon, and David set that marriage up, we probably have to assume that the Pharaoh had some understanding of the truth and was accepting him. Babylon, I don't know. But how about Philistia? Who are the Philistines who are engrafted into the kingdom and become God-fearing Gentiles? And how did that happen? It's the city of Gath. Remember the 5 Philistine cities? Gaza, Gath, Ekron, Ashdod, and Ashkelon. But David went to Gath, and he stayed there for a while, and the Gathites allied themselves with David, and later on in Zephaniah and other places where it lists the Philistine cities that are going to be destroyed, it never mentions Gath. The Gathites are allied with Israel. Ethiopia, of course, we have the Queen of Sheba. Later on in Jeremiah's day, we have Ebed-Melech, the Ethiopian eunuch, who protects Jeremiah. So right here we're told that numerous Gentile peoples were coming in. Can you think of another very famous Gentile who converted to Israel at this time? Plays a major role. I'm disappointed in you. Uriah the Hittite. And he married the granddaughter of Ahithophel, one of the leading men in Israel, Bathsheba. And after what David did to him and Bathsheba, Ahithophel was very alienated from David, and he helped Absalom as a result. And if you look at the list of David's men, you find a lot of men from other nations coming in. But here the psalm itself speaks of it. And it's primarily Hiram of Tyre, because he's very much involved in the temple. Well, then he is a co-builder of the temple. I've mentioned Melchizedek's bread and wine. I've mentioned Jethro's organizing of Israel, and I've mentioned Darius as the builder of the restoration temple. The Gentiles want the temple built, because that is what Israel needs to be the mediator for them. BC date, when is it? Around 1000 BC. In 1 Chronicles 13:1 to 14:2, we have, and I won't read all of this, but I want you to see early on the association of Hiram with the ark. In 1 Chronicles 13, this is the chronicler, probably Ezra, giving his slant on David's bringing the ark up to Jerusalem and the disastrous result. David puts the ark on a cart, which was not supposed to be done. The Philistines had done it, and God has sent the ark back to Israel on a cart from the Philistines. And I guess David and the other men thought that if God allowed the Philistines to do it, that they could do it too. But they were wrong. You're not supposed to get your religious ideas from the Philistines, and your liturgy is not supposed to come from the Philistines. God had said they were to carry it on their shoulders, and they had it on an ark, and Uzzah reached out to steady the ark when God caused the cows who were pulling it to jump around. And when the Philistines put the ark on a cart, those cows made a beeline straight to Israel. But when the Israelites put the ark on a cart, those cows were very obstreperous, and they almost knocked the ark on the ground, and Uzzah touched it, and God struck him, and everybody got nervous and began to realize that God means business when He says, lift me up on your shoulders, don't put me on a cart. And so the ark was in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. And verse 14 of chapter 13 says this, and just remember, we have to ignore chapter breaks because they weren't there. Thus the ark of God remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months, and Yahweh blessed the family of Obed-Edom with all he had. Now Hiram, king of Tyre, sent messengers to David with cedar trees, masons, and carpenters to build a house for him. David realized that Yahweh had established him as king over Israel. Here again, when you get the Gentile sponsor, that's when you realize that God has established you. The same thing was said in Samuel. Not till he gets the message from Hiram is it said David realized that God had established him. Because being established means being put in this position as priest to the nations. But you'll notice that this is put here in Chronicles immediately after the ark is brought to Jerusalem, and the relationship between Hiram and the temple begins to be established as a theme right here. Now, if we look at Psalm 45, we will see a number of other dimensions of this temple building, and on page 3 of your notes, we have Psalm 45, and I want you to look at it, and I want us to read it together, and I need somebody to act as a deacon. Peter, could I get you to act as a deacon? Could you come up here? We want to read this together. The parts that are in italics, the deacon will read, and the first line I will read, and the parts in boldface you will read. Now this is about the building of the temple and Solomon's marriage to the daughter of Egypt, to the Shulamith. And so, Psalm 45.
For the musical director to the tune Lilies, Maskil of the sons of Korah, a song of wedding.
My heart is overflowing with a good theme.
I recite my composition concerning the king.
My tongue is the pen of a ready writer. You are the most excellent of the sons of Adam.
Grace is poured into your lips.
Therefore God has blessed you forever. Gird your sword upon your thigh, O most mighty, with your splendor and your majesty.
And majesty, be victorious. Ride forth on behalf of truth and meekness, righteousness.
And let your right hand display awesome deeds. Your arrows are sharp.
Let the nations fall beneath you.
In the heart of the king's enemies. Your throne, O God, is forever and ever. A scepter of righteousness is the scepter of your kingdom. You love righteousness and hate wickedness. Therefore God, your God, has anointed you with the oil of gladness above your fellows. Myrrh and aloes, cassia, perfume all your robes. From the ivory palaces, music of strings makes you glad. King's daughters are among your honorable women. The royal bride stands at your right hand in gold of Ophir. Hearken, O daughter, and consider, and incline your ear. Forget also your own people and your father's house. The king is enthralled by your beauty, for he is your Lord, so worship him. And daughter Tyre presents a gift. Your face the rich among the people will see. All glorious is the king's daughter within.
Interwoven with gold is her gown.
In embroidered garments she is led to the king. The virgins following her are her companions. They will be brought to you. They are led in with gladness and rejoicing. They enter into the king's palace. Instead of your fathers will be your sons. You will make them princes in all the earth. I shall perpetuate the memory of your name everywhere, generation after generation. Therefore will the people praise you forever and ever. Well, this gives you an example of a complex psalm. You have some triple lines and some double lines, and so you can do it a variety of ways. I wanted to give you a feel for that. And this psalm actually is addressed to the king, to the bride, and then to the king. And in the first reference here, the king is Solomon, and the bride is the daughter of Egypt. And notice in the middle of the bride section, daughter Tyre presents a gift. Hiram, I'm certain, sent a present to the wedding. But more than that, because of the Song of Solomon, we know that this marriage is a symbol of the temple and God. Because when you read the Song of Solomon, you find that all the language to describe the girl, the Shulamith, and Shulamith just means Mrs. Shalomo. The word Solomon in Hebrew is Shalomo, and Shalamith is just the feminine of that word. Shalomo means peace, and Shalamith means Mrs. Peace. So this is Mr. and Mrs. Solomon, and who else would it be, I submit, than the daughter of Pharaoh? She's described in terms of being out with her brothers and being a shepherd girl and all this, but the book is full of symbols, and so we can't press that too far. But she is described in temple imagery and in garden imagery. She's got deers and wheat fields, and he has alabaster legs and gold, and all the language, lilies and pomegranates are used all over the place. And notice that Psalm 45 is set to the tune, Lilies. Lilies come up all over here. And in fact, the Temple of Solomon itself has standing out front 2 gigantic bronze lilies. I have a whole paper on those bronze lilies out there, Jachin and Boaz. They represent king and priest, but they were just gigantic lilies, freestanding pillars outside the temple. And they spoke of the love between God and His people. Well, this entire series of imagery here, God's marriage to His people, Solomon's marriage to the daughter of Egypt, and remember Moses married a Gentile woman too, all of that is celebrated in the same idea here, and the Tyrians are involved. Daughter Tyre is worshiping at the temple. Daughter Tyre is celebrating the marriage of Solomon to Mrs. Solomon. And all of this links together at this time in history. Don't ever think that you should read Song of Solomon apart from studying the Temple of Solomon, because the imagery from one explains the other. They are mutually interpreting. Each is the context for the other. And Psalm 45 fits in there as well as another dimension of the same basic paradigm. Well, I have mentioned that Hiram and Solomon traded back and forth. This is in 1 Kings 5, 10 to 11. I don't think I'll read that because I read the parallel passage in Chronicles. But Hiram sent, well, it's just 2 verses. Hiram gave Solomon as much as he desired of cedar and cypress. And Solomon gave Hiram 20,000 cores of wheat as food for his household and 20 cores of beaten oil. And Solomon gave that to Hiram year by year. And so there's an exchange of food, and in a broader sense, sacrament. The land of Eden filled with fruit trees, that's what Israel is. Bread and wine and oil, 3 sacramental substances, go out to Hiram, and Hiram sends back all the other stuff they need to build the temple. Now, over the years, Solomon got in debt to Hiram, and he wound up way in debt to him, and this was an act of unwisdom on his part. Now, 1 Kings 9, 10 to 14 tells us that the relationship did not end, well, it may not have ended, but it went through a rough time. Remember also, Hiram's a lot older than Solomon. Hiram was a friend of David when David first became king. And David reigned for 33 years after Hiram began to help him build his house. And now we are in the 20th year of Solomon here. And so this is 53 years after Hiram first contacted David. So Hiram is an old man at this time, and Solomon is probably only about 40, and Hiram is probably at least twice that old. 1 Kings 9, 10 and following says this: It came about at the end of 20 years in which Solomon had built the 2 houses, that is, the palace and the temple, that is, the house of Yahweh and the king's house. Hiram, king of Tyre, had supplied Solomon with cedar and cypress timber and gold according to all his desire. Then King Solomon gave Hiram 20 cities in the land of Galilee. And Hiram came out from Tyre to look at the cities that Solomon had given him, and he wasn't happy with them. And he said, "What kind of cities have you given me, my brother?" And they were called the land of Cabal to this day, which means trash. And Hiram had sent to the king 120 talents of gold. Now, a talent is a big hunk of gold. It's a couple of $1 million worth of gold. And Solomon had done some things. Building the temple was one thing, but when we read over here in 1 Kings 7 about Solomon's own palace, or is it 6? Wherever it is, we find that he made 100 golden shields for ceremonial processions and the like. Seems like probably a little bit more than he needed, and he went way in debt to Hiram. And if you get in debt, you're headed for alienation. And so finally, the only way he could make it up was to give Hiram these cities, and apparently they didn't amount to much. They were up in Galilee, and Galilee is the area of Tyre. It's up there in Asher, that area. But Hiram didn't like them, and Hiram gave them back. 2 Chronicles 8, verse 2, which I have here in your notes, is a verse that shows that Hiram actually gave these cities back and said, "You can keep your cities." But I don't think Hiram was alienated from God as a result. But this is the beginning here in Kings of Solomon's own fall away from the Lord, and we begin to see it right here in that he didn't really treat Hiram the way he should have. Now, what happens next in history is that there is a dynastic overthrow. The southern kingdom of Judah and the northern kingdom of Israel split because Solomon oppresses the people for the last 20 years of his reign. The people were happy to build the temple and the palace. That made them feel good. And then Solomon decided, well, these people are so used to coming up here and working 1 month out of every year, I'll just keep them going. And so he kept them going, building all kinds of other things, and the people resented it. And after 20 years, they were ready to elect some Republicans and shrink the size of the federal government in Jerusalem. Well, Rehoboam came to the throne, and the people came to Rehoboam to establish him. And this is a constitutional monarchy in Israel. The people had to agree to the new king, or else they'd find a younger brother or somebody else to be king, I guess. Well, the people sent their representatives to King Rehoboam and said, "Lighten the tax burden." And Rehoboam listened to all the young Democrats who were his associates, and he said, "We're going to add more taxes to you." And so the northern tribes said, "Well, this is just a confederacy, and we can leave." And they were right. It was a confederacy, and they were free to leave the political organization of Israel. Now, they were supposed to continue to go to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh as ultimate king, as high king. Yahweh is Agamemnon. You see, he's the high king over David and any other kings that might be there. But, of course, Jeroboam of northern Israel put a stop to going to Jerusalem and actually set up a new religion. So we have a division in the kingdom of Israel, and after a couple of generations, we have a dynastic overthrow in northern Israel, and Omri overthrows Jeroboam's sons. And Omri makes Israel, northern Israel, into a major player. In fact, the other nations around refer to northern Israel as Omri land. That's what they call it, like we call countries in Africa Bechuana land and Zulu land and Somali land. They don't use this word land anymore, but if you ever collected stamps, you know the stamps always said land attached to them. And the same here in the ancient world, Omri land. And Omri's son was Ahab. At the same time in Tyre there was a dynastic overthrow. The descendants of Hiram I were overthrown by worshippers of the Tyrian Baal. The pagans kicked out the God-fearers, and Ethbaal, who became high priest and king of Tyre, and his daughter's name was Jezebel, and she was married to Ahab. So now we have exactly the same thing we had earlier. We had a religious union between Hiram and Solomon at the temple, in which the temple was dominant over Tyre. Now we have the same thing, a religious union between Ahab and Tyre, only this time Tyre is dominant. Ahab is allowing the religion of Tyre to come into Israel, whereas formerly Hiram was having the religion of Israel come into Tyre. So we have simply inverted the relationship, and this is apostasy of Tyre. And the apostasy of Tyre means that the prophets deal with Tyre. The prophets don't send letters to China, because China was never in any type of covenanted relationship with Israel. But they send letters to the nations that had become in covenant, who knew the truth and now have rejected it, and gone back to human sacrifice and these other horrible practices. Isaiah chapter 23 is Isaiah's brief oracle against Tyre, which comes early on, and we need to just briefly glance at it. Isaiah is told to tell this about Tyre, and this happens, maybe a century or so after Jezebel and Ahab, and a century or so before Ezekiel's prophecy, which is what we will look at shortly and will occupy us for the rest of the evening, till about 2 a.m. Isaiah 23. The oracle concerning Tyre. Wail, O Tarshish ships, for Tyre is destroyed without house or harbor. It is reported to them from the land of Cyprus, be silent, you inhabitants of the coastland, you merchants of Sidon. Your messengers crossed the sea and were on many waters. The grain of the Nile and the harvest of the river was her revenue, and she was the market of the nations. Be ashamed, O Sidon, for the sea speaks, the stronghold of the sea, saying, I have neither travailed nor given birth, neither brought up young men nor reared virgins. When the report comes to Egypt, there will be anguish at the report of Tyre. Wail all the way over to Tarshish. Wail, O inhabitants of the coastland. Is this your jubilant city, whose origin is from antiquity, whose feet used to carry her to colonize distant places? Now, what's going on here? Tyre and Sidon were merchant cities. That's how they made their money. Plus, don't have no map here, so have to have the imaginary map. The coastland of Israel, Sidon is here, Tyre is here. The fortress of Tyre is actually built on a little rocky island off the coast. It wasn't all that big, so there was another city of Tyre on the mainland, and the city-state took in other little towns and areas round about, because all these are city-states, like Athens or any other city-state, or Troy or any other city-state in the ancient world. But the citadel of Tyre was on this island, and it's equivalent to the citadel in other cities. Citadel means inner city. In the ancient world, a city had a wall around it. A village has no wall. But a city has a wall. And in the middle of the city is the highest place, and there's an inner wall, and that's the fortress or citadel. So when you attack a city, you break through the outer wall, and then you have to, all the leading people will go into the inner city in the highest place, and you'll have to get into that citadel as well. It's important to understand in a number of ways. The temple is like this. Jerusalem is like this. A number of passages in the Bible refer to this. The two walls. Well, what Tyre had was their citadel was not in the middle of their city. It was out on this island. Nobody could get out there to that island easily. Now, God says He's going to destroy Tyre if they don't repent, and Alexander does. And what Alexander does is he tears down the part of Tyre that's on the mainland here, and he just dumps all the stuff into the sea and builds a land bridge out here and takes the city, the citadel. But that's what Tyre is. They're very strong, virtually impregnable, and God says they are going to be hurt real bad because they have sinned against Him. Verses 8 and following of Isaiah 23. Who planned this against Tyre, bestower of crowns? Whose merchants were princes, whose traders were the honored of the earth. Yahweh of hosts has planned it, to defile the pride of all the beauty, who despise the honor of the earth. Overflow your land like the Nile, O daughter of Tarshish. There is no restraint. He has stretched His hand over the sea. He has made the kingdoms tremble. Yahweh has given a command concerning Canaan to demolish its strongholds. He has said, You shall exult no more, O crushed virgin daughter, Sidon. Arise, pass over to Cyprus, even there you will find no rest. In these ancient cities, the city walls were impregnable as a virgin daughter. And of course, if an invading army got through the walls, they would ravish all the women too. And so there is a parallel between the inviolability of a city's walls and the inviolability of the virgins in the city. And in the ancient cities, there were vestal virgins or priestesses who were supposed to stay virgins and who tended the sacred fire of the city in the citadel, and their inviolability was connected to the inviolability of the city itself. And you could destroy the city one of two ways. An army could come in and break down all the walls and take the virgins, or the virgins could sin and allow themselves to be violated, in which case the gods would no longer protect the walls. You may remember your Roman history that Rhea Silva, one of the Vestal virgins, became pregnant, and the Romans, they put her to death because that meant that the walls would no longer be safe. And the same thing happens in the Bible. You remember that the sons of Eli slept with the women who guarded the gate of the tabernacle. And God says, all right, no more protection. And He allows the Philistines to come in. Very interesting parallel. And why we are supposed to be, spiritually speaking, virginal, and if we are, then our ways are protected. Well, the same thing here, you see. This is a stronghold, and it's like a virgin, but He says, virgin daughter of Sidon, Tyre, you will not be protected. That's what that imagery is from. And He says in verse 13, behold the land of the Chaldeans, this is the people which was not. Assyria appointed it for its desert creatures. In other words, the Assyrians have defeated the Chaldeans already. And he goes on and he says the Assyrians are going to destroy Tyre. Now what happened? It's hard to read these prophetic portions out loud because they're so dense that your mind gets lost trying to follow them anyway, unless you study them. But the Assyrians destroyed the Tyrian city-state, and it was basically in ruins for 70 years. Now the Assyrians did exactly the same thing to northern Israel. In other words, both sides of the Ahab-Jezebel alliance received the same judgment from the same people. The Assyrians destroyed Tyre and they destroyed northern Israel, and both of them were desolate for about 70 years. And then they were rebuilt somewhat. But they were supposed to learn this as a warning. The Assyrians were the warning from God. God raised them up by sending Jonah to them, and then they went bad, and God sent them against these two apostate nations. At the end of that time, Tyre rebuilt itself. At the end of that time, northern Israel was reconquered by Josiah. Josiah sent his army up into northern Israel and reconquered it all and reunified the nation. And most people aren't aware of that, but that's what the text tells us. Josiah reunified the nation and rebuilt northern Israel at the beginning of his reign. But they've been warned. Both nations have had 170-year exile as a warning. And they should learn. And they don't learn. And so now we come down to the end. Judah is going to be destroyed and taken by Nebuchadnezzar, and so is Tyre. Ezekiel 26 to 28 describe in 4 chapters the forthcoming destruction of Tyre. And we now understand why God would spend 4 whole chapters discussing Tyre. Because the Tyrians are not just some nation that happens to be nearby. They were covenanted with God. There is a whole book of the Bible dealing with the judgment on Assyria. Why? Because the Assyrians were converted. They're converted by Jonah, they go bad, and the whole book of Nahum is directed against them. So the nations that receive the judgments from God are the nations that have drawn near, who have been drawn near, and then go bad. Now, what I don't think we should take the time to do is read all of this, but I do have it just briefly outlined for you. Ezekiel 26 describes the forthcoming destruction of Tyre. And the main thing I want you to notice here is in the first verse. It came about in the 11th year, this is Ezekiel 26 now, on the first of the month that Yahweh's word came to me. Does anybody remember what was going on? Well, he rebelled in the 9th year. The 11th year, the siege has been going on for 2 years. Nebuchadnezzar is investing the city, and the city is about to fall. Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, and in about 4 months, Nebuchadnezzar will take the city. And while Jerusalem is being invested, message is sent to Tyre, you're next. That's the message. You are next. And after he sends a message to Tyre, Ezekiel is going to spend about 5 chapters on messages to Egypt and saying, when Nebuchadnezzar is done with Tyre, he's coming for you. And it took Nebuchadnezzar 13 years to take Tyre down, and after he did, he went and took care of Egypt. And that's the meaning. And all these messages come while Jerusalem is being destroyed, because Jerusalem is the center of the world. When Jerusalem falls, everything else falls. When Jerusalem is rebuilt, then everything else can be rebuilt. Jerusalem is the navel the omphalos of the world. It's the center. You take it down and everything else falls. Now this first chapter, Ezekiel 26, simply describes how the city will be destroyed. Nebuchadnezzar will do this. And then there is a lamentation over the city in chapter 27. And I want to read a little bit of that to you and listen to the imagery used in this lamentation over the fall of Tyre. The description of the fall and then a song, a series of poetic images to describe the fall of the city. Thus says Yahweh God in verse 3 of chapter 27. O Tyre, you have said, I am perfect in beauty. Your borders are in the heart of the seas. Your builders have perfected your beauty. They have made all your planks of fir trees from Senir. They have taken a cedar from Lebanon to make a mast for you. Of oaks from Bashan they have made your oars. With ivory they have inlaid your deck of boxwood from the coastlands of Cyprus. Your sail was of fine embroidered linen from Egypt, so that it became your distinguishing mark. Your awning was blue and purple from the coastland of Elisha. The inhabitants of Sidon and Arvad were your rowers. Your wise men, O Tyre, were aboard, and they were your pilots. The elders of Gebal with her wise men were with you, repairing your seams. All the ships of the sea and their sailors were with you in order to deal with your merchandise. By the way, ladies and gentlemen, when you read in the Bible about blue and purple and scarlet, that was real expensive stuff in the ancient world. We can go to the store and buy colored clothes if you want to. Like this tie here, see. But in the ancient world, the only way you could dye fabrics was from little secretions from mollusks and snails. And, of course, it was wool that was dyed, and stuff was real expensive. So it's very rich and ornate to have deep purple and blue, dusty blue and scarlet material. Well, Tyre is described, you see, as a large ship sailing on the sea, which is equivalent to that island that they had, that fortress island. Now listen to all the people involved with Tyre and see if it rings a bell at all. I've already mentioned Sidon and Gebal. Verse 10, Persia and Lud and Put were in your army, your men of war. Verse 11, the sons of Arvad with your army on your walls. And the Gammadim were in your towers. Tarshish was your customer. Verse 13, Javan, that's Greece, Ionia, Yawan, Ionia, Greece. Tubal, Meshech were your traders. Those of Beth Togarmah gave horses. The sons of Dedan were your traders. Syria was your customer. Judah, the land of Israel, were your traders. Damascus was your customer. Vedan and Greece, Ionia, paid for wares from Uzal. Dedan traded with you in saddlecloths. Arabia and the princes of Kedar. The traders of Sheba and Raamah. Haran, Cana, Eden. The traders of Sheba, Asher, and Kilmad traded with you. Boy, that's an awful lot of different people. Does that remind you of any place in the Bible? Genesis 10, the 70 nations. See, it's as if Tyre is the concentration point for the entire Gentile world. Israel is the priestly nation, and Tyre is sort of the captain, the concentration point of all the Gentile world. And so, when Tyre falls, it's actually a judgment to the entire world. Because all these nations mentioned in Genesis 10, a few of them are Ishmaelites, a few of them are Edomites, but most of them come all the way back to Noah. They're all involved here, and they all fall when Tyre falls. So you begin to see how this is written. Tyre's involvement with Israel was a symbol of the entire world's involvement with Israel, for good or bad. Now when we get to chapter 28, we start in verses 1 to 10 with the destruction of the civil leader of Tyre. And he's described here as the leader of Tyre. And God says, because your heart is lifted up, and you said, I'm a God, and I sit in the seat of gods in the heart of the seas, yet you're a man and not God. Although you make your heart like the heart of God, behold, you're no smarter than Daniel. As Ezekiel is writing here about the time Jerusalem is being destroyed, and he's referring to his good buddy Daniel, who was at the court. And of course, you know those Jews hated Daniel. He was the ultimate quisling, up there helping Nebuchadnezzar, advising Nebuchadnezzar on the proper techniques for destroying Jerusalem. But see, Daniel knew that Jerusalem needed to be punished, so he was there. But Ezekiel says Daniel is the wisest of all. Just remember that Daniel is the number 2 man in the Babylonian Empire. When Jerusalem is being invested by Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel's number 2. He's Nebuchadnezzar's chief advisor. The wisest man in the world, God puts right there next to Nebuchadnezzar. So you know the Jews hated Daniel, unless they were righteous. Well, Ezekiel praises him here, and that's just a parenthesis, and he describes how the king of Tyre is going to be brought down to the pit because he claimed to be a god. He was like Adam. And then we come to the passage that is so much fun. Ezekiel 28:11 and following. Listen to a little bit of it. I've got it for you on the next page, page 5. And this here on page 5 is my translation just from the Hebrew, and I've made it as literal as possible. And so I want to read that to you. Also, you can see the rhythm of the passage. And let me just read it through, and then we'll remark on it a little bit. You were the model of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your adornment: sardius, topaz, and diamond, turquoise, onyx, and jasper, sapphire, carbuncle, and emerald. And of gold were the mounts and settings you wore. On the day you were created, they were prepared. You were the anointed cherub, the guardian. Such I ordained you. On God's holy mountain you were. In and among the stones of fire you walked. Blameless you were in your ways from the day you were created, until wickedness was found in you. Through the breadth of your trade, violence was filled inside you, and you sinned. So I drove you in disgrace from God's mountain, and I expelled you, guardian cherub, from being among the stones of fire. Then the same thing is said again. Your heart became proud on account of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom because of your splendor. To the earth I hurled you. Before kings I made you a spectacle. And then it said a third time. By your many sins, by the dishonesty of your trade, you polluted your sanctuaries. So I made fire come out from your midst. It consumed you, and I reduced you to ash on the earth before the eyes of all those watching you. All those knowing you among the nations are appalled at you. To an horrible end you've come, and you will be no more forever. Now that's the poem. Who is it talking about? Well, the first interpretation of this, and probably the most common among Reformed commentators, traditional Calvinistic commentators, is this is talking about Adam. And that Ezekiel simply rises up to talk about the king of Tyre and describes him as Adam. Adam was in the garden of God. Adam was supposed to be in charge of it. Adam was there with these beautiful stones. Adam was cast out, and the king of Tyre is like Adam. There are some problems with that. There's nothing in the Garden of Eden in Genesis about precious stones being there. The precious stones were in Havilah: gold, bdellium, and onyx. Bdellium is the word that covers all the gemstones. And as we'll see in a moment, these 3 elements are found in something else, but they're not found in Eden in the beginning. Second interpretation, the most common among the fundamentalists, is that Satan is the person referred to here. And that the king of Tyre is not being described as Satan, but that actually Satan is the true king of Tyre behind the human king. And so he is the anointed cherub. And that this is the heavenly Eden, and that Satan was covered with these gemstones, and he was beautiful, and he was on the mountain of God, and he was among the fiery stones, and he was blameless, and then he was cast out because he was a cherub, and this describes the fall of Satan. There are a number of problems with that as well, and that is that there's no indication that Satan was on a mountain or in Eden, and it doesn't fit. Moreover, the term cherub or anointed cherub can also refer to someone else that is far more likely to be. The third possibility, well, I've actually discussed it already, is that the political king of Tyre is likened to Adam, and that the Adamic imagery is used here. The other interpretation is that actually Adam himself is described here, and that's quite problematic. I think by far the most likely interpretation is that this is a description of the high priest of Israel. And that becomes obvious when you look at the details. The high priest of Israel is the king of Tyre. Now, why would that be? Because Hiram made the temple the religious center of Tyre, and he thereby recognized the high priest as the spiritual ruler of Tyre. Then that covenant is not changed. Jerusalem is being invested when this prophecy is given. And it is given as much to Jerusalem as it is to Tyre. Notice what's said here about this man. And let's read it through now again, just the parts that count, as if it was describing the high priest, and notice how well it works. The garden of God, if we studied it out, is equivalent to the tabernacle and the temple. You were in Eden, the garden of God. Every precious stone was your covering. Well, the sardius, topaz, diamond, turquoise, onyx, jasper, sapphire, carbuncle, and emerald are 9 of the 12 stones on the high priest's breastplate. And as I've given it to you in your notes, they are in a relationship to what is on that breastplate. These are rows 1, 2, and 4 from the breastplate. They begin with Reuben, the sardius, and end with Levi the priest. They are in a chiastic structure. 1, 2, 4, 2, 1. You can see this. Row 2 is reversed. Row 3 is completely missing. Gad, Asher, and Issachar. The northern tribes have already been removed. But anyone coming to Ezekiel out of the Old Testament would immediately recognize these stones and their position as a variant of the high priest's breastplate. He is the one who is dressed in stones. He has the onyx stones on his shoulder. All of these are in sockets of gold. And he has the bdellium stones, the stones of fire, on his breastplate. The white, the black, and the gold. Bdellium is a white stone and refers to all these shiny stones, stones of fire. And then the black stone is the onyx, and the gold is the settings. And they're all referred to here. Of gold were the mounts and the settings you wore. On the day you were created, they were prepared. God prepared the garments of the high priest then. You were the anointed cherub guardian. The high priest guarded. The priests were armed to kill anybody who tried to get into the tabernacle and temple. Nobody was allowed to go in there except priests. And they were anointed. You were on God's holy mountain. What is the mountain? Mount Moriah. And before that time, any place, because the tabernacle is a symbolic holy mountain. In and among the stones of fire you walked. What are stones of fire? Okay, ladies, hold up your hand, and you will see that this is a stone of fire. I don't have one. But if you have a diamond or any other gemstone, it has fire in it. And that's what a stone of fire is. That doesn't mean a rock that has fire coming out of it, folks. It means a gemstone, a sparkly stone. That's what it is. And so he is in and among them. Then God says he will drive him in disgrace from the mountain, that he became proud, and he will be hurled out and become a spectacle before the kings. And that is what is said about Israel. He says, repeatedly the prophets say, I will make you a spectacle before the nations, and all who see you will hiss and say, boy, I hope that never happens to us. Good grief. And also, being cast out is what's just about to happen in about 4 months to the high priest. He's going to be cast out, and the temple is going to be torn down, and he's going to be taken into exile. And then even more so, verse 18, by your many sins, fire comes out from your midst, it consumes you, and I reduced you to ash. That's a reference to Nadab and Abihu. So, the sin here is the sin of polluting the sanctuary. It says, where is that expressly said? Oh yes, verse 18. By your many sins, by the dishonesty of your trade, you polluted your sanctuaries. I mistyped that, I'm sorry. The Gentiles cannot pollute the sanctuary. This is a technical argument, but let's just understand it a little bit. The Gentiles can't pollute the sanctuary because they can't go in there. If they walk in there, if Pontius Pilate, it wasn't Pilate, it was Pompey. Pompey comes and walks into the temple, and he walks into the Holy of Holies, and there's nothing in there, because he thought there'd be something in there, and there wasn't, because the ark had been lost. Well, the ark was in the Well of the Souls, and it wasn't found until during World War II by Indiana Jones. But it wasn't in the Holy of Holies. And Pompey goes in there, but did he defile the temple? No, because he has no legitimate access there. He didn't defile the temple any more than a fly go into the room and buzzing around would defile the temple. The only people who can defile the temple are people who have access to the temple legally. Only the priests can defile the temple. And so this has to be referring, again, to a priest. Far more likely then, I think, almost to my mind, without a shadow of a doubt, the true king of Tyre in a spiritual sense was the high priest of Israel because of the covenant between Tyre and the temple, because Hiram built the temple, because Hiram helped set up the high priest, and because what is described here are the garments of the high priest, the setting of the high priest on the mountain of God, in the house of God, and the casting of him down before the nations who will be appalled. All that is the language used of Israel. This is said during the investiture of Jerusalem itself, just before it really happened. And I think that really solves the problem of who is being spoken of here. Well, when was this fulfilled? I've suggested that God, through Ezekiel, rises beyond Tyre to deal with Jerusalem once again, because Jerusalem is the ruler of Tyre spiritually. When was Tyre destroyed? Well, Ezekiel 29, which moves on to discuss Egypt, tells us in verse 18, Son of man, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made his army labor hard against Tyre. Every head was made bald, and every shoulder was rubbed bare. But he and his army had no wages from Tyre for the labor that he had performed against it. Therefore I'm going to give him Egypt. Well, after Jerusalem was destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar went up to Tyre and spent 13 years destroying it. And then he went down to Egypt and took care of them. God said, through Jeremiah, all nations are going to serve Nebuchadnezzar, and if they rebel, I'm just going to spank them into submission. That's Tyre. Now I want to conclude by looking at the book of Revelation and how some of this Tyrian city imagery is applied to the destruction of Babylon in Revelation. Now, some of you are familiar with our view of Revelation, which we operate with in this context, and some of you aren't. I take, and I think most of the men in the room here that we work together on these things, are satisfied that Jerusalem is the main city being described here. That Revelation was written before AD 70, that the bulk of the book concerns the judgment on the old creation, which has two poles, Jerusalem and Rome, the Gentile pole and the Jewish pole, and that Babylon is Jerusalem, the beast is Rome. And in chapter 18, Babylon is fallen, and there is a lamentation over the city, and it is a lamentation over Jerusalem then, according to our interpretation, which of course is the true interpretation. Amen and amen, right? At any rate, that is the way I will be doing it tonight. Chapter 18, verse 9, starts to talk about this fall of Jerusalem or Babylon, and it uses a bunch of language pulled up from Ezekiel's description of Tyre. And all I want to do here is try to say, how come the language regarding Tyre is applied to Jerusalem? And I think the answer to that is fairly simple. Tyre was a covenanted city ruled spiritually by the high priest, and so what's said about it can be applied to Jerusalem because Jerusalem is the covenanted city spiritually ruled by the high priest. This deals with trade, and the entire lamentation is by merchants and traders. Some have said, well, this must be referring to Rome because there would have been a lot of trade with Rome. Others have said, no, it's referring to Jerusalem because there was a lot of trade with Jerusalem. I think both of those are wrong. The book of Revelation is written in symbols, and trade in Revelation is not talking about economics and business relationships. It's talking about liturgical relationships. In Revelation 3:18, Jesus establishes the meaning of that symbol when he says, I advise you to buy from me gold refined in fire, and eye salve that you may see. So the business of buying and selling has to do with your relationship with God. And of course it's taken up from Isaiah where the same language is used. Ho, everyone that thirsteth, come and buy without money and all this type of stuff. Similarly, in chapter 13, verse 17, we're told that under the reign of the beast, and of the beast, the land beast, the Herods, No one was able to buy or sell except the one who has the mark, either the name of the beast or the number of the beast. You had to have this mark on your forehead or on your right hand in order to buy or sell. Well, that's not talking about whether you could go to the bazaar and buy a straw hat or anything else. It means whether you were allowed to go to the temple and the synagogue. No one was allowed to engage in worship unless they had, "We have no king but Caesar," written on their forehead or their hand. The Jews said, "We have no king but Caesar." By doing that, they enthroned the beast in the Holy of Holies, and that's what Revelation is dealing with. And the mark of the beast, the golden plate of the beast, says, "We have no king but Caesar." And the law of the beast is written on the hand, and it says, "Caesar is Lord." We won't have Jesus, so we have Caesar. And no one is allowed to go in the synagogue or the temple who doesn't have that. That's what it's talking about when it says buy and sell here. And you may disagree, but then you would be wrong. When we're dealing with Revelation, there's only so bold you can be. But at any rate, I want to challenge you to think about it that way. That's really what it's talking about in the whole book, is who is allowed to draw near and worship God and where. And the synagogue and the temple are the places being controlled by the land beast. The Herods controlled who was high priest. They set up the high priests. They were in charge of the temple. And so the land beast, the false prophet, Herod, who killed John the Baptist, the last prophet, and who killed James, New Covenant prophet, that guy is in charge of the temple, and he requires people to be in subjection to Caesar in order to worship. That's what's being spoken of there. And so when we read in Revelation 18 all this stuff about traders and merchants lamenting, we mustn't think of it in literal terms. When we interpret Revelation, we don't read literal wherever possible. We read symbolic wherever possible. Because it says right at the beginning, the revelation of Jesus Christ, which God gave to Jesus to give to his bondservants, which he sent and signified to John. He wrote it in signs or symbols. So the whole book is written in signs and symbols. So we need always to remember that. Sometimes there are passages in the book that almost look like you could take them literally, but remember, it's written in symbols, so be careful. And here when it talks about these merchants lamenting over the fall of the great city, this is actually symbolism. And we have three groups that lament. Verses 9 and 10 are the lamentation of the kings of the land, and in Revelation, the kings of the land are the priests. That's because in Daniel and Ezekiel, the rulers and princes of Israel are set up to be the priests of Israel. Ezekiel refers to the high priest as the prince. And when we get to Revelation, Revelation talks about the kings of the land, it's talking about the chief priests, those who are spiritual kings ruling out of the temple. And the kings of the land, the priests, lament in verses 9 to 10. The kings of the land who committed acts of immorality and lived sensuously with her, with Jerusalem, with the temple, will weep and lament over her when they see the smoke of her burning, standing at a distance because of the fear of her torment, saying, "Woe, woe, the great city Babylon, the strong city, for in 1 hour your judgment is come." So first of all, and there's more here, it's a woman being burned up, and in the law, the daughter of a priest who plays the harlot is burned up. She's killed, and then her body is burned. Nobody's burned alive in the Bible, but that is the judgment, and so that's applied here. Babylon is harlot Jerusalem, and she's burned up. And the priests, who are the ones who played the harlot with her, lament. The second group is the lament of the merchants of the land. The merchants of the land are the rulers of Israel. Chapter 18, verse 3 says, "All the nations have drunk of the wine of the passion of her immorality, and the kings of the land have committed acts of immorality with her. And the merchants of the land," your Bible may say merchants of the earth, but earth in Revelation is always land of Israel. Merchants of the land have become rich by the wealth of her sensuality. And similarly in verse 23, "The light of the lamp will not shine in you any longer, the voice of the bridegroom and bride will not be heard in you any longer, for your merchants were the great men of the land, because all the nations were deceived by your sorcery." So the great men of the land, the actual rulers, I would say probably the Sanhedrin, are spoken of here. Now listen to their lamentation, verses 11 to 17, and see if this rings any bells with you. Besides Tyre, the merchants of the land weep and mourn over her because nobody buys their cargoes any longer. Cargoes of gold and silver and precious stones and pearls and fine linen and purple and silk and scarlet, and every kind of citron wood and every article of ivory and every article of costly wood and bronze and iron and marble, and cinnamon and spice and incense and perfume and frankincense and wine and olive oil and fine flour and wheat and cattle and sheep and horses and chariots and slaves and human lives. And the fruit you long for is gone from you, and all things that were luxurious and splendid have passed away from you, and men will no longer find them. The merchants of these things who became rich from her will stand at a distance because of the fear of her torment, weeping and mourning and saying, Woe, woe, the great city! She who was clothed in fine linen and purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and stones and pearls, and in 1 hour such great wealth has been laid waste. Does that list of items ring any bells? Because it's very similar to another couple of lists in the Bible. And it tells you what's really being talked about. This is Exodus chapter 25. Tell the sons of Israel to raise a contribution for me to build the tabernacle. And this is the contribution you are to raise: gold, silver, and bronze, blue and purple and scarlet wool, fine linen and goat hair, ram skin dyed red, porpoise skins, acacia wood, oil for lighting, spices for anointing oil, and for fragrant incense, onyx stones and setting stones, and so forth. Or also Exodus, well, the same thing is repeated in Exodus 35. I think there may be, well, I was thinking there was another list, but I'm not finding it right off the bat. You see, the things that are listed here are things that are used in the work of the temple. There are a couple of extra things added in, because the book of Revelation has those things added in, like pearls. The city in Revelation, which is the greatest temple, has pearls. But you have cattle and sheep, you have oil, flour, wheat, frankincense, wine, spices, incense, cinnamon, various kinds of wood, gold, silver, bronze, purple, scarlet. This is in general a description of the temple and more broadly the worship functions of the city. So again, the idea of trade here is not so much an economic idea. It was with Tyre, but the language is now being lifted up and applied in a liturgical sphere. Liturgical transactions are being symbolized as economic transactions. And it says that the rulers of the land had power as a result of their control of the trade in the temple, the items used for furnishing the temple. And that's exactly true. That's what we see in the Gospels. They had control over the temple. They could kick people out of the temple. The Pharisees could. The Pharisees were not priests. They weren't kings of the land. They were the great men of the land. And they could put people out of the temple, out of the synagogue. They do the man in John chapter 7. Jesus heals him, so they kick him out. And Jesus says later on that's what they're going to do to you. As Peter and I were talking earlier, and that passage in John 9 is almost an allegory. Jesus heals the man. People try to pressure him into going back, and Jesus goes away. And at the end of the story, Jesus comes back. It's kind of like the early church. Jesus has healed them. The Jews are trying to pressure him into going back. Jesus has gone away, but he'll be coming back. But they're going to be kicked out. And the kings of the land who control this trade, the religious trade of the temple, or the merchants of the land, are doing that. But there's a lot lifted up from the Tyrian city trade, the passage that we looked at here. And finally, we have the lament of the sailors of the sea. Chapter 18, verses 17b to 19. Every shipmaster and every passenger and sailor and as many as made their living by the sea stood at a distance, and they were crying out as they saw the smoke of her burning, saying, What city is like the great city? And they threw dust on their heads and were crying out and weeping and mourning, saying, Woe, woe, the great city, in which all who had ships at sea became rich by her wealth. See, that's directly taken up from Ezekiel's description of Tyre. Everybody was getting rich from Tyrian wealth and trade. For in 1 hour she has been laid waste. Well, who are these people? One possibility is they refer to Gentiles connected up with the city. I think it's more likely that this is another symbol for the Pharisees who traverse land and sea to make one disciple but make him a greater son of hell than themselves. Those who sail out from Jerusalem to extend the false counterfeit gospel of the Judaizers and the Pharisees, I think are probably the ones being mentioned here. At any rate, my lecture is not on Revelation 18. That was a coda to the lecture. We wanted to look at Tyre, and I just wanted to mention this because the Tyrian prophecies, the language from them is drawn up and applied here in Revelation 18, and I believe in the ways that I've suggested. In conclusion, let me make 4 conclusions here that I think we can draw from this and increase our Bible knowledge. A, Tyre's covenantal link with Jerusalem made her spiritually subordinate to Jerusalem. And that made explicit what was generally true of all Noachic Gentile powers. The Siberian Americans over here, and the Chinese, and the civilizations in Australia in the year 1000 BC. I mean, who knows? I mean, just because they're aborigines now doesn't mean they may have had airplanes in Australia 3,000 years ago. We're so silly. We think these people have lived in these decadent tribal situations for thousands of years. Who knows what they were like 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago? I don't think they had airplanes. But they may have had cities and all kinds of things down there. All those people were linked into Israel, and for all we know, they had some knowledge about it. There was a whole lot more trade in the ancient world than we give credit for. We know that the Phoenicians came over here to America and were trading. We have pictures of Iroquois Indians on ships visiting Egypt. We can tell from the feathered headdresses that they were almost certainly people from this continent. And the idea that there wasn't any trade back and forth around the world in the ancient world is just silly. Those people took risks and they sailed everywhere. And so the nations knew about Jerusalem, but Tyre is the big picture of the subordination of the Gentile world powers to Jerusalem and of the sponsorship of Israel by the Gentile world powers. And as we saw when Tyre is judged, all the nations of the world are kind of linked in there. So that's one point. Second conclusion, the central destruction of Tyre is actually the destruction of high priests in the temple. Tyre follows soon after. Tyre is sinful, so we're going to destroy Tyre. We're going to strike Tyre right at the center of Tyre. What's the center of Tyre? Jerusalem. You understand this? Because the high priest and the temple are the religious center of Tyre. Now, the Tyrians didn't recognize that at this point in time, but God did, and that's what counts. It didn't matter that they didn't. They had their high places to Baal and Venus, but that didn't matter. They could have their little Venuses and their little Baals all over the place. And as far as God was concerned, they were covenanted in with the temple and with the high priest. And so in describing the destruction of Tyre, he describes the judgment against the high priest. And it's a domino effect. Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel will take care of Jerusalem, and then they'll go off and take care of Tyre, and then Egypt. Third, C, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 is pictured partially as a destruction of a spiritual Tyre, which was trading in false worship. And fourth, by way of application, D, the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 means the subsequent destruction of all Noachic Gentile powers because they were all spiritually linked to Jerusalem. That's what we learn from the pictures in the Old Testament. When Jerusalem falls, all the other nations, the ripple effect goes out. Similarly, here in Revelation, when the harlot falls, the next thing that happens is the beast and the false prophet fall. Rome and Idumea, Rome and Herod. And then the other nations begin to fall, and the world becomes Christian, generation by generation. But it starts at the center. Well, that's the lesson on Tyre in the Bible. Do any of you want to make points or contradict what the Master has spoken? Or ask any questions? Give me a break. Yeah.
Your page 5D, verse 119, is called the second destruction of Tyre.
No, the first destruction is by the Assyrians. And then Nebuchadnezzar destroys it a second time. And after that, it does rebuild, and finally Alexander destroys it. And there's a prophecy in Zechariah concerning that. Zechariah 9.
It doesn't appear in Ezekiel 119 that Nebuchadnezzar takes the city. I mean, it sounds like he tried, but he doesn't.
Well, we know from secular history that he did.
Okay, so there's no Bible reference.
As far as I know, that's the closest thing to a Bible reference.
That he tried.
Well, I think it means that he took it, but that it took so long that by the time he had destroyed the city-state of Tyre, all their resources were depleted, so he didn't get any booty. I mean, what good is it to destroy a city if you don't get any booty? And it took him so long to do it that it wore out his army and he didn't get any booty as a result. So God says, well, I'm going to make it easy for you to conquer Egypt and you'll get lots of booty there. And we could have a second lecture. In fact, we could stay for another hour and a half and do the same thing with Egypt and look at Egypt's relationship with Solomon and then trace prophecies against Egypt and then come to Ezekiel, the next several chapters in Ezekiel which deal with Egypt. And it's pretty much the same thing, but not quite as concise as Tyre. And basically, I wanted to get to this high priest, that interesting passage in chapter 28, so that's why I picked Tyre.
Even the 28 is the high priest, there's still a link back to Adam.
Yeah.
Because it's symbolism of the high priest.
Well, yes, it's just that if you want to say this is a description of Adam in the garden, you've got a problem with the clothing and the stones and everything. But since the temple is the developed form of Eden, then there is, there's a relationship back to Adam and a relationship forward to Christ.
Has anybody
I am sure that there are others who have suggested a relationship with the high priest. There have to be. It couldn't be new with me. To be honest with you, almost all the commentaries that have been written in recent years have been written from liberal or neo-evangelical, which means textually liberal perspectives. And so what they do is they try to root around the archaeology of the city of Tyre and explain everything that way, which is not the way you're supposed to read the Bible. You don't interpret the Bible in the light of archaeology, you interpret in the light of earlier passages in the Bible. And as a result, because their hermeneutical methodology is wrong, they're not helpful. And I did this study a number of years ago, and in preparing this again, I didn't look back and see if anybody actually suggested this approach, but I imagine it's been entertained. Sometime in the history of the church, almost everything's been entertained. Usually, the interpretation has been that it refers back to Adam or to the king of Tyre spoken of as an Adam, or that the king of Tyre is spoken of as a high priest. I didn't even mention that, but there are a number who do that. They say, well, this is a description of the actual political king of Tyre, but he's described as if he were the high priest of Israel. But you see, from the liberal standpoint, Hiram's relationship with David and Solomon is probably all fiction anyway, dreamed up by priests in the days of Josiah. So they can't put the Bible together the way I did tonight and say there's a historical, there's a history here. There was a treaty back in these days, and it was broken here and transformed here and so forth. They can't do that.
Or even from skeptical about all of these Old Testament none of it's really converted. We're all life.
Yeah.
We're not going to see anything.
Yeah, there is in the Reformed tradition a tendency to say that baptism is circumcision, and so the only people who were saved in the Old Testament were the circumcised people, and the Gentile God-fearers, really, there are hardly any of them. And I think that baptism is circumcision, but it's also a bunch of other things. But yeah, that's quite true. The evidence of converted Gentiles in the Old Testament is monumental. I mean, they're just all over the place. There are two men who went out to spy the land, Joshua and Caleb. Caleb was a Gentile. He was one of the mixed multitude. Caleb the Kenizzite. He's adopted into the tribe of Judah. Moses marries one. They're just all over the place. But there's a tendency not to see them. And once you become alerted to that, you notice how often Israel is acting as a priest to the nations, and how generous God is with grace in the Old Testament to the Gentiles. But yeah, I think you're right, that a lot of the traditional commentaries have not really seen that point, and thus would once again not get the connection the way we've drawn it. Yes, ma'am?
You're saying that prior to the church age, there are a lot of saved. Well, now, in Ezekiel 28, when it says to the earth
No, it means that the temple was in the high place of the city on a mountaintop. It's like Mount Sinai, all the other mountains, and he's thrown down. And even beyond that, there's an implication there that, as you know from Jerusalem, what's down at the bottom of the mountain there is Gehenna. It's the trash heap. And actually, and the altar is built the same way. The altar is built with a little gutter around the edges where the garbage collects. And so being cast down off the top is even more than just being thrown down the mountain. It also carries with it a hint of being cast into the garbage heap. It is symbolic of hell, but there was a real place, the Valley of Hinnom, right, outside where the stuff was. Yes, Bert?
There's another way to say that the destruction of Jerusalem, you have the destruction of the whole old world order, old covenant order.
Yeah, with the destruction of...
Is an example of that?
What's an example of it?
This connection of Tyre linked with...
Oh, yes. What you have in Ezekiel is baptized by God at the age of 30. The heaven opens and God comes on him and makes him the Son of Man. And he prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem until the city is invested. When the city is invested, God says, you can't talk anymore. And so for 3 years, Jerusalem is being destroyed. And Ezekiel sends letters out to all these other nations saying, you're next. And then after the city is destroyed, Ezekiel starts prophesying to Israel again. And so the picture is real clear that the destruction of Jerusalem is the center of the world, and then the ripples of that go out to all these other nations. And the same thing's there in Revelation. Jerusalem first, then the beast and the false prophet, then all the other nations.
Okay, so this gives us actually first witness or whatever that the destruction of Jerusalem is the destruction of the old covenant order and everything is aligned with that.
Yes, that's right. Everything's linked in, so when you hit the middle of it, shatters all these links and everything else. The false prophet in Revelation? I believe that it's the Herods. That's another very large question, though. Throughout the Old Testament, you always have the Gentiles, the Edomites, and the false Jews as the three enemies. And you have them in the Gospel. Jesus is put on trial by the Jews, Herod, the Edomite, Idumean, and the Romans. And Paul is put on trial by the Jews and Herod Agrippa and Festus, the Roman governor. So when you get to Revelation, you've got the false bride, the Jews, you got the beast, which is Rome, and you have the false prophet, which I take to be the Edomites, the Herods. But to substantiate that in detail would take more time than we want to do tonight. But that trinity of enemies, I think, starts and runs through the whole Bible and is also in Revelation. Yes, the apostate Jews of that century are the harlots, the harlot city. What that means to us now is that false Christians are the harlot city. But when this is written, our understanding is that this was written to deal with the situation in the first century. And those who opposed the church were the Judaizers. Remember, that Paul deals with. And the Judaizers are the harlot and the church is the bride. Well, I have a whole little book out there on that. That was our conference last year, ma'am. We dealt with Daniel, and I wrote it all up, so I commend it to you. It's great stuff. I think we better stop.